Good evening. I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to the second of our 2022 lecture series. This is just one of the few programs and events that the Society sponsors throughout the year. And for over 160 years, we have been preserving and promoting the history of South Carolina and the nation. I hope you'll visit our website at schistory.org to find out more of what we do. I'm very excited about tonight's presentation. Now, for those of you who are in attendance, I will remind you that you'll be muted throughout the webinar, and we do hope to have time for questions. So if you'll type any questions you have in the chat box, I'll read them out to our speaker after the talk. And I am delighted tonight to welcome David Shields. Dr. Shields is the Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. He writes books on several subjects: the history of photography, early American literary culture, and Southern food and agriculture. He also chairs the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, aiding in the restoration of classic Southern grains and vegetables. For this work, the Southern Foodways Alliance awarded him the Ruth Fertile Keeper of the Flame honor. His books include the award-winning The Culinarians, which explores the lives of American chefs, Southern Provisions, about the rise and revival of Low-Country cuisine, Pioneering American Wine, and most recently, with his friend, chef scholar Kevin Mitchell, Taste the State, South Carolina's signature foods, recipes, and their stories. Dr. Shields works with chefs and farmers all over the state, ensuring that the most flavorful classic crops endure. Throughout the South, people know him by his nickname, the Flavor Saver. Please welcome Dr. David Shields.
Faye, thank you for the introduction. I have to say before I begin my talk tonight that I've been a faithful user of the South Carolina Historical Society for, I'm not going to say exactly how many years, but I remember when the fireproof building was built. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the changing signatures of Carolina cuisine. Places that have a tradition of distinctive food tend to believe that the dishes that are signatures of that tradition have endured unchanging over time. But change is the nature of history. And you who have witnessed the transformations of the Charleston restaurant scene since 2000 have seen at close range how fashion causes things to appear, to alter, and to disappear. When Kevin Mitchell and I wrote Taste the State, we confronted the fascinating transformations of the key dishes of Carolina cookery. Tonight, I'm going to survey some of those changes in relation to Low-Country cookery. It would take 3 hours to do the entire state. I don't have that much time. In 2015, I was invited by the Historical Society to speak about Charleston's first menu, the bill of fare offered by the major institutions of public hospitality in the wake of the American Revolution. And to begin tonight's survey, I want to spend a moment recalling that first menu, the one that announced Charleston's gastronomic adequacy for transatlantic travelers to the port city. Here is the notice of the Exchange Coffee House for September 1784. Down at the bottom of this, you will find a transatlantic menu. Caribbean green turtle, listed there, was the most fashionable food in London and American coffee houses from the 1780s to the 1830s. The trio of caffeines, coffee, tea, and chocolate had been fixtures of the transatlantic urban world since the 1660s. Now, soups deserve some discussion. The final decades of the 18th century were the great age of soups. The first restaurants, Julian's Restaurateur in Boston, founded in 1793, promoted bouillon and broths as the central foods that restored nutrition and health, the thing that a restaurant did. Green turtle soup, oyster soup, turnip soup, okra soup, and mock turtle soup were the earliest soups named in public advertisements, and they mattered greatly in 1800 Charleston. First of all, they were serviceable. You could keep a soup hot all day long, so anyone coming in at any hour of the day could have soup. In the 21st century, the culinary category of relishes has been relegated to hot dog pickle relish and that tray of olives, celery, pickled cauliflowers, and jicama batons that often appear on people's side tables. In the late 18th century, professional cooks developed the category to designate a range of dishes that provided ideal accompaniments to main dishes. For instance, fried onions or fried mushrooms for beefsteak. Macaroni and cheese was a relish introduced into Charleston cookery by Angelo Santi in 1794 at his coffee house at 86 Church Street. In July 1785, a formidable rival to Mr. Jones of the Exchange Coffee House appeared in the city. Pastry cook and confectioner Augustine Moore set up shop on 20 Meeting Street. He offered everything that the Exchange Coffee House did and more. Portugal cake, seed cake, iced cakes, custards, jellies, and pastries of every sort. By December of 1785, he took over the Exchange Coffee House. So, what constituted the noteworthy dishes in the first age of South Carolina's fine dining? In addition to beefsteak, the signature dish of Great Britain, Moore advertised ham and veal as everyday offerings at his Exchange Coffee House. And he expanded the list of main dishes to include oysters dressed in every desirable manner and all kinds of poultry, roasted and boiled, hot and cold, with relishes to be had all hours of the day. As early as 1785, Charleston had one eating house specializing in oyster suppers and pickled oysters, and this was Mrs. Fisher's in Unity Alley. Advertisements for other venues in the 1780s and 1790s specified turkeys ducks, chickens, and guinea fowls under the fowl category. While fish and game were central to the country hospitality of the plantocracy, the first inn or coffee house to regularly offer both was Jeremiah Jessop's, the Charleston Recess and Bellevue Coffee House, 3 miles up Charleston Neck. And this was in 1803. Jessop also is the man who introduced ice cream to the Low Country. Reading through the early newspapers, you quickly realized that eating houses thought that the way to attract customers was to advertise the proteins being served and the beverages that were available. And this would be true from the early Republic well into the antebellum period. Here's how the French Coffee House, a very reputable venue in Charleston, advertised its fare in 1850. The primacy of green turtle is still maintained, but overfishing by factory ships in West Indian waters would make them virtually extinct in a generation. The Frenchness of this menu is perhaps most pointedly apparent in the absence of pork, the southernmost of all meats, in the list of offerings. The specification of fish and shellfish is interesting as well. There are 6 types of fish commercially fished, harvested off of Carolina waters during the antebellum period, and 4 of these 6 appear, but not the most important one, blackfish. And it isn't absent here because of seasonality, but because all of the blackfish catch is shipped up to the north, because the fishing fleet that is operating off the coast of Charleston in the antebellum period is owned entirely by Yankees. I think some of you will notice that not a single vegetable is named in these published bills of fare. Yet, if you look further down the columns in the newspaper advertisement section, you will encounter elaborate ads for vegetable seed. The public market abounds in a variety and abundance of Charleston garden vegetables. Prior to 1850, they offered 2 kinds of artichoke, 4 varieties of asparagus, 31 varieties of beans, 8 beets, 10 types of broccoli, way more than is now available in grocery stores, 38 kinds of cabbage, 9 types of carrot, 10 kinds of cauliflower, 3 sorts of celery, 10 cucumbers, 1 variety of eggplant, 15 miscellaneous greens, collards not among them, 3 sorts of kale, 19 lettuces, 5 melon varieties, 1 okra variety, 15 alliums, 2 parsnips, 37 different varieties of garden pea, 3 peppers, 1 pumpkin, 14 radishes, 1 rhubarb, 2 rutabagas, 2 spinaches, 5 squash types, 1 tomatoes, and 23 turnip varieties. I specified every one of these vegetables, their dates of introduction, the seed sources, and the local broker in chapter 2 of my book, Southern Provisions. So those of you who are gardeners and want to find out what the early Low Country garden was and what was in it, you can look at that list. You know, there are a couple things that jump out from these listings. Garden peas, cabbages, and turnips and broccoli were way more important, way more the center of one's taste than they are now. Both turnips and cabbages were grown also as livestock feed, so that might account for some variety there. But what about those 37 varieties of garden pea? And I've listed them all here in this listing here. Clemson, in its annual grower instruction manual, recommends 4 varieties now, of which the famous Wando pea, which is locally bred and is a dominant southern pea, is the most famous. There are also 3 edible snaps and 3 snow peas. So 10 peas total versus 37. Another thing to note is that for a range of vegetables, sweet potatoes, okra, tomatoes, cowpeas, guinea squash, that's eggplant, benne, there existed little or no commercial seed market. Varieties were maintained entirely locally, never imported, and they were exchanged in barter arrangements. Numbers of these were African diaspora crops. Others were Native American in origin. Their places in the gardens, fields, and kitchens of Carolina can only be tracked in agricultural journals and in farm records. Since sweet potatoes are propagated by slips, the local sourcing is understandable. The one eggplant variety listed, which was a purple guinea squash, we recognize as the kind of ancestor of the Florida high bush and black beauty eggplants which dominate our produce sections today. What we never got on the market was the Gullah red eggplant, which you see in that central circle in this slide, the Solanum aethiopica, that looks curiously like a tomato. This was a home garden patch vegetable preserved by Black farm families until 12 years ago, when a seed house arson fire destroyed the last known southern line. It does, however, survive in Brazil, and Gullah Geechee farmers now have been growing it again, sourcing the seed from Brazilian sources. What about that one variety of tomato on the Charleston seed market? Well, there are 2 things to think about here. While tomatoes were used hereabouts, particularly in stews and sauces, prior to the big national craze for tomatoes in the late 1830s, they were not the intensely red spheroidal tomatoes that have been the American standard since the 1870s. They were yellow, orange, pink, purple, dark green. They were lobed, sometimes wrinkled, and they had a tendency to ripen in the outer portions and not in the center. And this last reason is why they tended to be cooked early on rather than eaten fresh. They could be quite acid, so preserving them in sugar was popular in the mid-19th century, and you'll find this preparation in local recipe collections as tomato figs. Well, so far we've glanced at menus from public eateries, newspaper advertisements from seed brokers, and articles from agricultural journals. But I haven't mentioned the source that most people first think about when wondering about culinary history: cookbooks. Carolina is blessed by a good number of manuscript cookbooks, and 2 antebellum published cookbooks, of which Sarah Rutledge's Carolina Housewife is the more famous. There are also about 130 recipes published in newspapers and in magazines from the pre-Civil War period. What you discover when you examine all of these collections is a disproportionate emphasis on baking and on confections made of sugar, that is, preserves, jellies, jams, and syrups. Because I've spent the last 15 years assisting in the restoration of classic Southern grains and canes, I've paid particular attention to changes in these things. For instance, the purple ribbon sugarcane only began being planted in the Low Country in the 18 teens. And it wasn't until 1825 that refined sugar was cheap enough to think about preserving one's yearly fruit harvest by converting it into jams, into jellies, preserves, or fruit wine. And also there was an explosion of sweet pickles in the pantry, like in the 1830s and 40s. Soft white winter wheat, such as purple straw, white May, and red May, enabled the world of cakes and biscuits to have flour locally sourced. Now, the antebellum period was an international era of innovation in terms of baking. Chemical leavens like baking powder, baking soda, enabled one to bypass the yeast rise. You had quick breads. The old beaten biscuit was supplanted by the soda biscuit, the type we know today. The cook stoves, which come in 1840s, 1850s, with their greater temperature control, make cake baking, meringues, and sauces possible. There was a dynasty of free African-American pastry chefs, Sally Seymour, Eliza Seymour Lee, who offered in Charleston pastry in the best French style. This family taught 2 generations of enslaved household cooks in Charleston who were cycled through their pastry shops in sort of like term task engagements. A household would send their cook to Sally Seymour for training, and they would work for 2 or 3 years in Sally Seymour's shop and then come back to the family. So you had a situation where in Charleston, of all desserts, only fruit pies and sweet potato pies were local. The coconut cakes, the caramel cakes, the apple cakes, the spice cakes, everything else was cosmopolitan. One thing that was local and became a signature was rice bread. The production of Carolina gold rice as the agricultural linchpin holding together the Charleston economy. And you have to remember that rice, not corn, not wheat, becomes the chief grain in Low Country cooking. It dominated breakfast with rice bread, rice griddle cakes, rice waffles, which have enjoyed a tremendous revival in the past 10 years nationally, and also rice porridge. But curiously enough, it wasn't in the antebellum period, but after the Civil War, when rice cooking underwent an extraordinarily powerful efflorescence. This was the era when pilaus or purlus underwent extraordinary elaboration. In the wake of the Civil War, a new meal became established in Charleston: lunch. The old cycle of breakfast, 3 o'clock dinner, and 7 o'clock supper had first been disrupted in the 1850s by the Mount Vernon Ladies Restaurant run by Theone Ruchis. Lunch was an importation designed to serve women shopping in the city and needing refreshment in midday. In the post-war period, lunch became a midday meal for working people in the city as well as women. And Mrs. R.W. Tork reigned as the matriarch of Charleston's restaurant world in the decades after the Civil War. She was the wife of tavern keeper E. Frederick Tork, and she shifted the focus of the house on the corner of East Bay and Queen Street from alcohol to food, and underscored the domestic pleasures of the table by renaming Tork's Tavern to Our House. In early 1868, we have a menu that offered cooter soup, boiled mutton with caper sauce, boiled fish, shrimp pie, and veal chowder. Boiled fish was the 19th century designation for poached fish. Veal chowder was a milk-based veal stew with fatback supplying the lipids. There's a category of dishes called mulls, which are more popular in the Georgia Lowcountry than the Carolina Lowcountry, that uses this kind of milk-based stew for meats. And this is a veal mull. In early autumn of 1868, the lunch menu featured green turtle soup, shrimp salad, and roast beef. The opening of oyster season every year was marked by a steaming cauldron of oyster soup. Seafood became more abundant in Charleston after the Civil War, in large part due to the work of African-American seafood broker at the Charleston market, Charles Leslie. It was Leslie who organized the efforts of the Mosquito Fleet, that volunteer group of African-American watermen who had migrated off the plantations once liberty came and decided to make a living on the sea. It was he who paid for the catch. The number of fish available on the market expanded from 6 in the antebellum period to 28. Porgy, drum, grouper, bone shad, that is, they offered the fillets boned, eel, soft shell crab. Leslie set up the first nursery in the South over in Mount Pleasant, and may have been the second nursery in the entire United States. Cobia, black brunt, mangrove, snapper, kingfish, sea trout, tile, yellowtail, spot. This availability made Charleston's fish market the best serve on the East Coast. Blackfish chowder became the signature of the Sullivan Island resorts in the latter part of the 19th century. You know, it's funny, in 2022, you can't get most of these in the Charleston market. And that's because Asian buyers purchase the cream of the East Coast catch. Indeed, they purchase every eel landing that is made in Beaufort, South Carolina. The entire eel crop is bought by Asians. Shrimp was sold from the market by hucksters in the early morning. And it was in the post-bellum period that shrimp and hominy and shrimp pie became central features of breakfast. And I'm sure you've heard this elsewhere. It wasn't called shrimp and grits in Charleston until the 1980s. It was always called shrimp and hominy. Creek shrimp commanded a particular premium, but in terms of the commercial crop, it was oceanic coastal shrimp that was being sold on the street. Hominy, or hominy grits, had been a major feature of Charleston food since the 1830s. And at that time, it was an export item to other parts of the South, where it was advertised as Charleston grits. In Charleston and in the Low Country, there was a decided preference for white flint corn grits. No yellow grits were served in Charleston prior to the 1920s, so far as any print record indicates. From the 1860s to the 1920s, the Charleston area became one of the most productive areas of truck farming in the United States. The Noisette brothers on the Charleston Neck became nationally famous for strawberries, garden peas, potatoes, artichokes, sweet potatoes, peanuts, and roses. Large-scale vegetable farming made high-quality vegetables cheaply and widely available. And as a result, in the 1880s and 1890s, we saw the rise in vegetable pilaus or purlus, eggplant pilau, peanut pilau, green pea pilau, summer squash pilau, limping Susan, hopping John. Here on the left, you see a peanut pilau and a recipe for an eggplant. You even had the development of certain nationally known signature vegetables associated with Charleston. And the two most valuable of them were the palmetto asparagus developed in Mount Pleasant in the 1890s, and the Charleston Wakefield cabbage, which was the best-selling cabbage nationally in the United States from 1900 to about 1925. You'll notice that it has an interesting conical shape, which is something that betrays its ancestry as from the Filderkraut, the very best sauerkraut cabbage of Europe. If you want a coleslaw cabbage, this is the one you want, this Charleston Wakefield. In the Gilded Age, end of the 19th century, there were other dishes that became quite important. Broiled riceberries became the rage at Nicholas Sotilli's Washington Square Tavern on the corner of Meeting and Chalmers Street. And for the first time, salads were popularized by Julius, the major domo of the Palace Cafe at 278 King Street. Crab salad, tomato salad, coleslaw using Charleston Wakefield cabbage, and shrimp salad. We tend to think about the 19-teens and 1920s in Charleston as a time of artistic awakening. It was the time of the Cultural Renaissance. And one of the most interesting attempts to define the culinary dimension of the Renaissance was Charleston pastel artist Fanny Mahon King's Charleston Recipes. This was a distillation of Charleston cooking into a few signature dishes. And these were okra soup, shrimp pie, tomato pilau, what we now call red rice, hoppin' john, sweet potato pone, pumpkin chips, pickled shrimp. Perhaps the most remarkable single recipe in the collection is Sally Seymour's 1820s formula for black cake, or the basis of fruit cake. Ironically, the Renaissance occurred at a time when fundamental features of Charleston food were being eradicated. Charleston gold rice stopped being grown for sale, World War I. Charleston's famous peanut candy, sold on every street corner, the groundnut cake, was regulated out of existence by the fly ordinance. The rice birds number began to drop precipitously, and it was no longer available for eating in local shops. Also, at the beginning of the 20th century, the supply of grocery stores, even grocery stores here in the Low Country, was being nationalized by industrial scale canneries. Northern canned pumpkin pie pie filling began to make inroads on the local sweet potato because of convenience. Throughout the South, this trend created anxiety. And in 1913, the Georgia Chamber of Commerce organized the local foods and local products crusade. Every county was tasked in Georgia with staging a dinner using products only produced locally. There were about 90 of these feasts held in November of 1913. This effort caught the attention of Charlestonians. On November 21 of 1913, the editor of the Evening Post observed that local hoteliers would profit by featuring local items. And they listed in particular Bull's Bay oysters, Kiowa clams, Edisto shad, Carolina rice, James Island yams, rice field turkey, jetty bass, battery shrimp pie, and Lady Baltimore cake. The resistance to nationalization and the assertion of local identity contributed to what may be called the invention of tradition. It's already visible in that list that I just read out. Rice field turkeys only emerge as a thing after commercial rice fields were abandoned and wild turkeys began feasting on the residual vegetation, including volunteer rice. And this was a relatively recent phenomenon in 1913. Lady Baltimore cake was the invention of the Charleston Christian Women's Exchange, popularized by the Owen Wister novel in which it was featured at the turn of the century. You know, many items that we now reckon important traditional foods, artichoke relish, 1917. William Dee's she crab soup, 1909. Pine bark stew, 1915. Benne wafers, 1922, so far as we can determine. There were earlier benne confections, benne twists, and benne cakes that date from the 19th century. Shrimp paste, which is a 1920s revision, rethinking of the old potted shrimp recipes of the 19th century. And things like peach leather, which was reckoned a local signature from the 1920s to about the 1980s. And then all of a sudden people seemed to forget about it. It wouldn't appear in the tourist shops anymore. All of these novelties of the World War I and early 1920s were certified as being traditional by inclusion in Rhett's 1930 volume, 200 Years of Charleston Cooking. I want to think, as I wind down this talk, about the 1950s. in part because of the publication of Charleston Receipts, which is a landmark which everyone is familiar with, but also because several restaurants made a concerted effort to put tradition forward. The Francis Marion Cafe and Everett's restaurant spearheaded the embrace of local signature foods. Mrs. Joseph L. Herman, who was the sales manager at the Francis Marion, mandated this emphasis. What exactly graced the menu? Charleston dishes, such as she crab soup, okra gumbo, and other things indigenous to the section. A reporter goes in 1953 and observes that she crab soup is always on the Francis Marion menu, as are hop and john, a rice dish, Seven Seas chutney, a relish, shrimp soup, Charleston style, and crackling bread. Other ads from the early 1950s note shrimp pie, Awanda cornbread, which is the Carolina version of spoon bread, red rice and potato pone. Everett's had William Dees himself in the kitchen. And Dees in the 1950s decided to go shrimp-centric in his cooking. There, quotation, Everett's perhaps offers shrimp in wider variety than is to be had anywhere else in the city. You can order shrimp salad, shrimp bowl, shrimp omelet, shrimp cocktail, shrimp creole, shrimp French fried, shrimp in a seafood platter, also deviled crab and she crab soup, as prepared by William Dees. Even Henry's, which was a temple of New Orleans cookery, felt compelled to put Charleston dishes on its menu after 1954. The success of the Francis Marion's Cafe and its menu, with tourists motoring to Charleston in the late 1940s, was one of the things that convinced the Charleston Junior League to canonize traditional Charleston food with a cookbook, Charleston Receipts. And that cookbook became nationally important in 1950 when food oracle Clementine Paddleford, who was the head of the New York Times food section then, visited Charleston at the behest of Leaguers Mary Huguenin and Anne Montague Stoney. In her syndicated report on the food tour she was given, Secret Dishes from Old Charleston was widely reprinted and drove a national demand for the cookbook, making it a Southern, if not a national, resource. What interests us now is the version of Low Country cuisine captured in this mid-20th century moment. What did she eat? What were the secret dishes? Well, okra soup, wild ducks, benne wafers, Bulls Bay oysters, shrimp pie, cornbread, Jerusalem artichoke pickle, pumpkin chips, shrimp paste, mullet roe, grits, cooter soup, syllabub, rice, wine jelly, guinea squash, venison steaks, and pine bark stew. Two African-American cooks were named particularly in the story. Samuel Faber, who was a major figure in 20th century Charleston food and agriculture, and well worth someone doing a research project on his many doings. He was the cook butler of the Stoney family. And the other one was Polly Watson, the cook of the Otranto Club, and you can see her down in the lower right corner there of this article. You know, Southern food historians make a great deal of New York Times writer Craig Claiborne's Southern pilgrimage in the early 1980s, where in Chapel Hill, he encountered Bill Neal's shrimp and grits and extolled Southern home cooking. Well, I'm here to say he did nothing that Paddleford had not already done a generation before when she headed the New York Times food section. And the messages, the importance of home cooking, local tradition, the African-American contribution differed in no significant measure. The end of the 20th century brought a crisis to Charleston food. You know, people had the recipes. And Alice Waters on the West Coast had declared that American food would be about the food of one's locality, not about French sauces. But when Charleston chefs explored the treasury of surviving recipes, using what was being grown in the fields around Charleston, the oldest generation of diners told them that the flavor was wrong. The yellow dent corn grits was not right. The white long grain rice wasn't right. Even the cabbage and the coleslaw was somehow off in texture and in bite. Well, what was the problem? Local farmers had been growing crops produced by late 20th century plant breeders who were intent on increasing the productivity, disease resistance, transportability, processability, earliness to maturity, and everything else except the flavor. Flavor was not even tested in the plant breeding trials. The ingredients that had made up Charleston cuisine and made it internationally famous in the 19th century, Carolina gold rice, the low oil African benne sesame, Sea Island white flint corn, the purple ribbon sugar cane, the Charleston Wakefield cabbage were all functionally extinct. At the turn of the millennium, the revival of Charleston cuisine has been predicated on the restoration of the classic ingredients that originally enabled it. The Carolina Rice Foundation, seed savers such as Dr. David Bradshaw of Clemson, geneticists such as Richard Ferry, Steve Kresovich, Rick Boyles, millers such as Glenn Roberts and Greg Johnsman, accomplished the systematic recovery of lost cultivars and their reintroduction to Carolina fields and tables. I'm sure that many of you tasted the change in local food that happened in the last 15 years. You'll remember the transformation that occurred when Husk and Sean Brock came on the scene. I am glad that I provided much of the historical research enabling that recovery. You have to know what's lost before it can be found. But what I think is really important are the unforeseen benefits of this recovery of ingredients with flavors. Cookeries that aren't traditionally Southern or Low Country can now make use of tomatoes that taste great, eggplants, which are sumptuous, purple straw wheat, which has that incredible nutty flavor that was so distinctive that it was used to flavor bourbon, wheated whiskey, we are now blessed by a bounty of good food. And even in the midst of this pandemic, that has not changed. And I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful that you've listened to me tonight. I understand that questions are in order here.
Yes, David, I'm going to do a few, if that'll be all right.
That'd be fine.
Let me see what we have here. Someone asked, what was raised at Leslie's nursery? I think you said it was on Mount Pleasant.
That's where he kept his soft shell crab nursery. He would have everyone bring in crabs that were ready to bust, and he kept them in impoundments. And when they actually shed their shells, he had a ready stock of softies from March to June. And it was the only place in the United States that you had a reliable supply of soft shell crabs. You didn't even have that in Manhattan.
I'll be darned. That's very neat. Another question, is Mahone King's book available in reprint anywhere?
It isn't, but if you go to the South Caroliniana library site at the University of South Carolina, they have a link which reproduces several classic South Carolina cookbooks. And one of the things that is linked there is King's Charleston recipes. And every page is there, and you can download it yourself in full color if you have a color printer.
Perfect, wonderful. And another person asked, where was corn grown in the white hominy era?
It was grown on Johns Island, James Island. It actually was a corn variety that was a native land race raised by the Siwi Indians, which was north of Charleston. And what was interesting, they lost the variety. But this last March, the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation and Dr. Jim Holland of North Carolina State University gave them back seed for Sea Island white flint corn. So they have their ancestral corn back again and are growing it. Anson Mills has grits made out of this. And there are places in the city that make it available. There's a little store on King Street near the overpass that you can buy it.
Yes, yeah, they're wonderful grits. Oh, I had a question. So Wakefield cabbage is extinct.
It has been brought back, and Nat
yay.
Bradford of the Bradford watermelon fame is growing it in Sumter. And so there are certain restaurants that are using it now, but for consumers, I don't even think you can get it at Grow Food Carolina. But this is something which I think in the coming years will be one of those ingredients that Carolina organic farmers and the people that are working in the Clemson Southern Heritage Ingredient Initiative, the farmers there will be growing. So once again, you will have the classic coleslaw taste.
Wonderful. And another person asked about the palmetto asparagus. Will it be found?
Now that's an interesting question. there was a patch of asparagus that was discovered by Dr. Jim Kibler up in Whitmire.
Mhm.
That might be it. And it's being grown out experimentally at the Moneta asparagus farm. So we have to wait. We have to get the genetics on it to make sure it's not a conover's colossal. What's interesting about the palmetto asparagus, it was a very tender, thick-stalked asparagus. And it was in the 1920s that the pencil asparagus became fashionable because physical culturists started telling people who wanted to lose weight that if you eat a fat asparagus, you're going to get fat. If you eat a skinny asparagus, you're going to get skinny. So
Interesting.
most, Mary Washington and Martha Washington were the great resistant skinny asparaguses grown.
Okay, so we'll have one more. We had two questions about a Lady Baltimore cake. Someone asked about where to find a recipe. I assume Charleston Receipts. And someone else asked what it was or what it is.
Yeah, it's in the family of white cakes, and there is a recipe that we included in Taste the State. So, go
okay.
to your reputable book dealer near you, pick up a copy, and you'll have a full-page recipe of a classic Lady Baltimore cake.
Terrific. Okay, well, that's good to know. Oh, and also, by the way, we have Dr. Shields Taste the State at our online gift shop as well, so you can find it there.
So if any of you have further questions, my email is dShields@mailbox.sc.edu. Every day I get questions from farmers, chefs, and people who are interested in local food. And as an employee of the University of South Carolina, whose wage is paid by you folks, I feel it's my responsibility to supply the information you want and need.
This was a wonderful talk, and you do a great service to the food industry as well. So thank you so much, David. This has been fabulous. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I hope you will also be back next week when Dr. Dan Littlefield will speak on slavery and the Carolina rice plantation. Also, if you're not already, I do hope you'll support the South Carolina Historical Society by becoming a member. So good night. Thank you. Y'all have a good evening.